Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Londoniyyah. Today we will be covering Darwinism. We will start off with the recitation of the poem, and then we will get into the thick of theism, naturalism, and Darwinism.
فصل نظرية داروين. لداروين نظرة التطور بالانتقاء بحسب التطفر في الكائنات بغية التكاثر في الحيوان دون قهر قاهر فجاء إنسان من القرود حتى بدا بشكله الموجود بل جاء من جد مضى مشترك مع القرود ذا قبيح المسلك ونحن لسنا ننكر التطور فليس من نص صريح ظهر لكنما زعمه داروين زعم كذوب هالك مهين ثم بنوا داروين في التجريب مبحثهم بالحس دون ريب فما استطاعوا بحث خلق آدم ولم يروا لذي الجراح بلسما فما لهم إثبات ذا أو نكره فخلقه لا يستطاع قدره وإنهم في نفخ طير عيسى لن تجدوا لنهدهم حسيسا.
So there we just heard some verses from the poem Londoniyyah in terms of Darwinism. In today's session I'm going to be covering its relationship with theism and naturalism. Now what I want to do in the beginning is I want to go through some history, right? And it's good to always go over the popular perception and then actually look into what it is academically, because that is the major problem. There's a huge difference between the way that this theory is actually promoted in the public, the way it's analyzed, the way people understand it, and the academic understanding of this theory. So as a quick sort of question, when was the first time in the public eye, not asking for you guys because you guys mashallah are learned, when was the first time that evolution as a concept was actually discovered? So if you were to go out and speak to some random person here in North London, what would they say? What sort of timeline would they give?
They would probably say like around the time of Charles Darwin.
Around the time of Charles Darwin. Excellent. That's the general idea. I think everybody agrees with that. Okay. And would there also be an association between Darwin's theory and atheism and naturalism? Naturalism, I think it's important to define. So naturalism would be the philosophical position that explanations have to be using natural causes and natural properties and processes and these types of things, denying anything supernatural, a god or soul or anything like that. So again, the question, what's the public perception about evolution and atheism?
The public perception is usually that evolution proves atheism because it kind of replaces God's creative power or his influence or his intervention in humanity.
Excellent. What else? Anybody want to give some comments about perhaps the role of the church and the decline of Christianity and that it's linked to atheism and Darwinism?
Yes, there's the idea that I guess religion in the form of the church was sort of opposed to science, or definitely prevented the scientific enterprise from really taking off. And so once science begins to, people begin to look at the world more scientifically and the role of religion decreases, then you have evolution, which provides explanations for that which was previously explained by religion.
Excellent. Anybody else?
Was there not some ancient Greek philosophers who basically rejected the supernatural concepts and said everything was a form of naturalism?
Yeah.
Before Socrates and Aristotle.
Yeah. So excellent. I think this is a good segue to actually get into what was the perception of the ancients when it came to biological change. So you're right on the money there that evolution as a basic idea, and even naturalistic evolution, was something that was theorized about, written about, discussed by the ancient world. Okay? Now what's very interesting is that we usually think, because of the way that this theory is propagated through the education system, through popular culture, through Netflix, through all of these types of things, we usually think, okay, so Charles Darwin came up with evolution is atheistic, and that's what led to the decline of religion in the Western world. This was a point of inflection. Of course, it was on its way down anyway. And then today they would also say this is a kryptonite. right? So there's a religious person, they're praying, walk up to them with this kryptonite, start waving it in their face, and they'll interfere with their prayer and they'll become a apostate or something, right? There's this idea that we have this powerful theory, we can wave it in people's faces, and it will lead them to basically disbelief and rejecting God and so on and so forth. Okay, so here let's start off the discussion about evolution itself that the ancients spoke about. So we have ancient civilizations in the Indus Valley civilization, modern day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that region of the world. We also have the ancient Greeks and other parts of the world where there is a discussion about biological change over time. There is a discussion about evolution. And then we find this tradition continuing in the Middle Ages. We find this in the Muslim world. We find this in the Christian world, biological change over time. And then when we come to say around the time of Darwin, about 50 years before Darwin, we had a French biologist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, from which you get Lamarckian evolution. So again, he had his ideas on evolution. He had the idea that there wasn't one origin, and we're going to get into why one later, right? He had the idea that there was multiple origins, and you had parallel lines of evolution taking place. And he had a mechanism as well. So you had a history, which you could call a forest of life, right? And he also believed in a mechanism, which we today refer to as Neo-Lamarckism. So he had his inheritance of acquired characteristics. The giraffe is reaching for leaves and its neck is getting longer, and so on and so forth. However, here's something very interesting. Evolution being something today in the public eye, which is supposed to be linked to atheism, is an idea which is new. This is very interesting. It is new. Why? Because in the past, before Darwin, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and the ones before him, going all the way back to the Indus Valley civilization, going back all the way to the Greeks, this idea of biological evolution being equated to atheism or naturalism was not there. Yes, you had some theorists who were naturalists who did not believe in God, and therefore they had their own sort of, if you like, atheistic evolutionary ideas. But this idea that evolution equals atheism, that if someone believes in some form of evolution, some form of biological change, that equals atheism, this is a radical shift in the history of evolutionary thought. This is very interesting. So, quick sort of question. Who introduced it? Who came up with this idea? Who actually started, pushing this out?
Didn't, sorry, I may be mistaken, but didn't Darwin's grandfather have similar ideas, Erasmus Darwin or something?
So, Erasmus Darwin, he was also someone who contributed to the theory. Again, what we find is, interestingly, he was a Freemason, for anyone that wants to look up his history. We find him speaking about evolution as well, but again, this link between evolution and atheism is not there even with him. And now, what's interesting is it's not there with Darwin either. Okay, now this is very interesting. So when Charles Darwin was a Christian, a creationist, he obviously did not believe in the type of evolution that he later on believed in. However, there was a point when he left Christianity and he had these evolutionary ideas floating in his mind, like for example that famous tree of life, that picture that we have, next to it it says "I think," right? And that's from his notebooks that were found. So he had that idea. He had the idea of natural selection. He had the idea that you have a lot of competition, you have a lot of demand and the supply is not there, so then you get this sort of competition. He got that from the economist Thomas Malthus. So capitalism gave the idea to Darwinism, and Darwinism then fueled capitalism, so you have this positive feedback loop going on. What's very interesting nonetheless is that Darwin himself believed in God when he first presented the origin of species, the main concepts, the main ideas, when he first presented it in 1858 here in London at the Royal Society. The Royal Society is the oldest scientific society in the world, right? It's a very prestigious society. So 1 year before the famous 1859 year that he published the Origin of Species, he presented his ideas at the Royal Society, and at that time he was a believer in God. He was a deist. He believed in God, but he did not believe in religion, did not believe in the standard, if you like, creation idea. But he did not accept atheism. And he never accepted atheism. This is very interesting. Now, the next year he published the Origin of Species. And when he published the Origin of Species, he again did not become an atheist. There's clear-cut evidence that he actually believed in God throughout that period, which is very interesting. So this idea that Darwin himself is an atheist and Darwinism leads to atheism, classical Darwinism leads to atheism, this is not actually Darwin's idea. Okay, now what's interesting is that in Darwin's time, it wasn't just known as Darwin's theory of evolution. There's another person who is there, and it was known as Darwin and this person's theory. And if you pick up, and we have some really old books here, if you pick up some books from the early 20th century, what you find is it doesn't say Darwin's theory of evolution. It says Darwin and Wallace. Who's Wallace, right? And why is he whitewashed from history? So Alfred Russel Wallace, he was a independent theorist to Darwin. They both came up with this idea around the same period, but they never met each other. But they knew of each other's work late into their development of their ideas. So Darwin, being the gentleman that he is, worked with him, and they together put this theory forward. Now, the question is, why do we not hear of Wallace today? What happened to Wallace? Well, interestingly, Wallace is somebody who, if you like, apostated from traditional Darwinism. So, like those books, and I'm sure some of the books they are, even I think prior to the Victorian era, you will find Darwin and Wallace's theory, Darwin and Wallace's theory, Darwin and Wallace's theory. In fact, the latest that I found was a book that was published in the 1990s, which is not that long ago. Some of you guys were born in that period. But because the person who wrote the book was quite old, right? They were born 60 something years earlier, right? So they still were affected. That's the last reference I found to Darwin and Wallace's theory. So up till the 1990s, in some places, Darwin and Wallace's theory. Now what happened with Wallace? Wallace basically realized that there's a problem in his mind, at least, with the theory, which is that you get an intelligent person from you get a so-called savage, what they call them, from say South America, and you bring those sort of people to Cambridge or to Oxford or to London. They study, and they're just as smart as their European counterparts. Now the problem here is your intelligence is linked to your survival and reproduction, and if you're out there in the bush and you are looking to survive and mate, and you don't need to be that intelligent as you need to be in Cambridge. So there should be a limit to how intelligent those people are, and if you bring those people to London or Oxford or Cambridge, they should obviously have this sort of glass ceiling. But what he realized is actually it doesn't apply to humans. Those people can be just as intelligent, and those people natural selection has developed their cognitive abilities way more than what is needed for them to survive and reproduce. So this made him doubt the theory, right? And Darwin, of course, was not happy at all about this, him coming up with these ideas. And also then he started pushing out some ideas on basically quasi-creationism type of ideas, intelligent design type of ideas, not the way we understand intelligent design today, but he definitely went away from the naturalistic type of commitment that you need to make in science, right? He started moving away from that. Famously, Darwin, wrote him a letter and said to him, "Don't murder our child," right? Because it's quite embarrassing. It's quite embarrassing that someone that you published the theory with, they go on and they come up with these types of things. Okay, so again, even Darwin's co-author, now he's completely whitewashed because it's a bit of an embarrassing thing for, especially if you're a new atheist and someone brings this up, how the co-theorist left the traditional fold. So what actually happened? Well, there were people around Darwin who were militantly atheistic, and they saw this theory as a golden opportunity to promote secularism, to promote atheism. And for some of them, it actually became a theory that they could use so they could enact certain social policies. Hence why you get social Darwinism, which again, by the way, is not endorsed by Darwin. And we can get into what social Darwinism is in perhaps another session. So what we find is you have vocal people like T.H. Huxley. Okay, T.H. Huxley. Huxley was a militant atheist, and he wanted to use this theory to actually turn people away from religion, turn people into atheists. So what we find with Huxley is people like him were the main proponents of trying to link Darwinism to atheism. People like this. And he was quite successful because Darwin was I guess you could call him an introvert. He was not somebody that, he was friends with his local church pastor, he's just living in his country home doing his stuff, and you have T.H. Huxley going out there debating religious people. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. Now what actually happened was Darwin was of course not aloof to what was happening with his theory, so he started writing. He started writing to counterbalance this perception. So he started saying things like, it is absurd to think that you cannot be a theist and believe and be an evolutionist, And he was in contact with Asa Gray. Asa Gray was a famous scientist who was also a subscriber to his theory, but Asa Gray, of course, did not believe in the traditional creation story of Adam and Eve, but he was a believing Christian. He reconciled in a theistic way and with evolution, with his Christian theology. And what's very interesting is when Darwin received this feedback from a commentator about his theory, when he published The Origin of Species, a commentator wrote words to the effect of, well, if God created every single creature, every single species individually, or if God created one cell, which evolved, the tree of life evolved into what we have today, bacteria, grass, elephants, everything. So whether God created things individually or God created one cell which evolved into all forms of life, it is just as noble for God. Something like this, right? It's just as, it doesn't diminish from God's majesty, if you like, right? Darwin was so impressed with these words that he actually put them in the second edition of The Origin of Species, right? Because he had six editions in total, right? He was, he was still writing at that point. So what's interesting is that he was not remaining silent. It wasn't like he was sitting there and he didn't want to get attacked by religious people, so he's dog whistling to his friends and saying, yeah, go and attack these religious people. He's starting to see, wait a minute, these guys are doing something I don't agree with. So he starts actively writing it. And what we find is that they are really poor attacks from the new atheists when you push out this narrative about Darwin. They would say things like, to the effect of, well, he was afraid, and that's why he wanted to sort of pander to the religious people. Well, why on earth was he afraid when he'd already done such a big thing like challenge the Bible, challenge the creation story? Secondly, we have letters written by him to his friends, which are private, which were never supposed to be public, which were actually rediscovered after some time. And those he's mentioning these things. For example, he's mentioning about his belief in God, and this is around the time he was he hadn't actually published the book, and we find after publishing The Origin of Species, he's still talking about God. And he would say things like, I had no intention to write atheistically, and so many times. And one of the things which he writes in a private letter is, because later on in life he became an agnostic, and became an agnostic because of the problem of evil and suffering, and that really affected him. His daughter died young, I believe she was under 10. His son died around the age of 2. He himself went through all these health issues. By the way, this is phenomenal, that he went through a lot of serious health issues, and we're talking about even before writing the book, which is why it took him perhaps so long, right? But what we find is that he still mentions God, and one of the clearest letters that we have in the latter period of his life is that he actually describes himself moving away from the belief in God and becoming more agnostic. But the wording of the letter is still kind of like he's not fully like committed to anything, right? He's just kind of like just flirting with agnosticism. But he adds to it. He adds to that letter, and he says, in my wildest fluctuations, I wasn't an atheist. Meaning, even if I was spinning around, I wasn't an atheist, right? And I think that's very important. That's very important to keep in mind. So now I hope we understand that the atheism's hijacking of the theory was something that he didn't plan, something he didn't foresee, but he could try to mitigate it in the way that he could, right? So we find that. Now what we find in the early 20th century is that Darwin, of course, didn't know about genetics. Genetics was even though Mendel actually contacted him and stuff like this, from what we know, he didn't read his paper. So genetics was not something that was fused together with his theory. So what we find in the early 20th century is that a fusion between genetics and the classical Darwinian theory, they fused together, and they called this the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis, and this is also known as Neo-Darwinism, right? So the word Neo-Darwinism is something that we get from the early 20th century. It's the infusion of genetics. Now someone may say Neo-Darwinism is totally different to, say, Darwinism. It's not really. The central idea is still natural selection, so it's working on random mutations rather than random variations, and there isn't a huge difference conceptually. But anyway, let's look at some of the interesting characters that are around in this period, right? One character who was very influential, and this is somebody who is the direct descendant of T.H. Huxley, which is Julian Huxley. So Julian Huxley was an important biologist, and of course he was a Darwinist, and he was also a philosopher, and he was also somebody who wanted to impact society. He wasn't just interested in, let me just speak about this theory, let me just try and modernize it. No, actually he wanted people to become atheists, and he actually was very clear that for the modern man, there is a new religion, and that new religion is Darwinism. So he actually wrote a book in the 1930s, and the book is called Religion Without Revelation. Religion Without Revelation. You can still get this book. In fact, I've got it somewhere in this room. and there's an old copy from I think just before World War II. In fact, he's mentioning contemporary events like Nazism in that book as well. So what he goes on to argue in that book, and also his later book, New Bottles for New Wine, that we have this religion which he calls evolutionary humanism. And in the same way that in the future, in the same way that today, no rational, sane person believes that the world is flat, likewise, nobody will believe in the future that God exists, right? So he was somebody that was clearly, militantly atheistic. He was somebody with some philosophical background as well. He wasn't just a biologist. And he wanted to promote these ideas all across the world. He actually was the founding member and the first president of UNESCO. Okay, now this is very interesting. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. That means his ideas are global. His ideas are infused in the United Nations. They're infused in the way that the structure functions of the UN. And this is right from the onset. This isn't now. This is right. Remember, the League of Nations, which we had, collapsed. Then you had the UN, and he's right there at the beginning of UNESCO, and he has these ideas which are being propagated. Then what we find is that, again, here, Darwinism being used as a way to justify atheism, we find in the works of people like Richard Dawkins in his famous book, The Blind Watchmaker. So Paley's famous watchmaker analogy, I'm sure everybody here has heard of it. So, Dawkins challenged, essentially design using the idea of the blind watchmaker. The blind watchmaker here being nature. Nature is the blind watchmaker. So what we find in that book is a very interesting admission. And what Dawkins essentially says is, Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. Okay? Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. So clearly there is an emotional attachment to this theory. Imagine a Buddhist says string theory allows me to become an intellectually satisfied Buddhist. You'd be thinking, why are you basing your philosophical position on something from science? And you can ask a whole host of questions. But you again find that there's that link that he makes between atheism and Darwinism. And also what we find is that in his 2006 book, The God Delusion, the central argument of the God Delusion uses Darwinism as a reason to deny God. So we find that, right? What we also find in an interesting clip online in which he's talking with Lawrence Krauss, and he makes a very interesting admission. He says, look, you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution, which is the opposite to what he's been saying all this time, right? You don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. However, if people believe to accept evolution means they have to accept atheism, then all I need to do is to convince them of evolution, and I can make them all into atheists. He actually shows his true colors. All of those things that he has been writing, especially in the God Delusion, he is saying something that he doesn't actually believe in. He actually admits in that video that he knows evolution doesn't lead to atheism. He knows that there is no necessary link between the two. Yet that has been his main argument, because as he says with his own words, if they actually think to believe in evolution means you have to become an atheist, then all I have to do is convince them of evolution. So he's given away that he has a malicious intent. He is somebody that doesn't actually believe in what he writes. Also, I think what's important to highlight is the idea of atheism being atheists hijacking Darwinian theory is something which has been written about by other academics as well. So this isn't just a theist saying, okay, this has happened or that's happened. You will find on the other side atheists speaking about this as well. What's interesting is, what is their main argument? What is their main argument? These people who are, essentially before Dawkins and even Dawkins himself, what is their main sort of way of linking atheism and Darwinism? Well, their basic argument is this: we can explain design as an illusion, and we can give a naturalistic explanation. Because we can give a naturalistic explanation, therefore there is no God. That's their basic argument. So their basic argument is, we can explain biological change over time, biodiversity, the origin of body forms. You can explain all of these things without reference to God, therefore there's no God. Can anyone guess what's wrong with this argument? What are some major flaws with this argument?
It confuses mechanism and agency.
Very good, but there's something even more obvious before we get to that, because that's going to be the main point I'm going to go to next. Okay, so maybe I wasn't as lucid as I should have been. If someone's saying Darwin destroyed the design argument, therefore there's no God, what's the problem with this?
Like the proof for God's existence isn't like necessarily the design argument.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's such an obvious rebuttal. And honestly, when you find these atheists trying to use these arguments, when you give them a simple rebuttal and say, well, you can use a moral argument, you can use contingency argument, you can use cosmological argument, we can use the argument from personal experience or whatever, you can just say, well, we can use whatever argument. You literally catch them like a deer in headlights, right? They're just going to be bedazzled. They can be like, what? Like, they haven't thought about this point. If the design argument is supposedly disproven by Darwin, how on earth does that mean there is no God? All it simply means is the argument for God's existence using the design argument is no longer valid. In fact, even if other arguments did not exist, philosophically you cannot say that means there's no God. I mean, you don't even, from an Islamic viewpoint, we believe in the fitrah, right? We believe it's natural. So we don't even necessarily need these arguments. So it's such a poor viewpoint. But there's also something else that was being alluded to here, which is the false notion that just because you can use naturalistic explanations in science, referring to natural properties and natural causation, natural effects and so on and so forth, therefore there is no supernatural, is conflating two types of naturalism. Is conflating methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. Okay? So, philosophical naturalism, we all know. What is it? It is what's also known as naturalism, which is the idea, the philosophical position, that all that there is physical causes, and everything can be broken down to natural properties, natural processes. That's it. There's no God, there's no angels, there's no soul, there's no immaterial mind, there's no objective morality, there's no real consciousness, none of these things. Okay, that's the philosophical position of naturalism. Methodological naturalism is actually a methodology, is actually a lens that you use when you are doing science. It is not a philosophical position. It is, if you like, a lens that you put on while you're doing science. Now, the origins of methodological naturalism, when did this idea come that you can't mention God in science and all these things, that discussion is is another thing. We won't get into that. However, what's important to know is this. Imagine if in this room right now, I say to you guys, okay, so you're all going to come to this Londoniyyah class, but no one's allowed to bring in anything that is red. So Abdurrahman comes in here and he's got that shopping bag and he's got that red, I think you're bringing in some sushi. It's got some red stuff on there. And I'm like, take it out. Why is that there? I just kick him out. I just kicked out. That red sofa rocking chair thing that Hijab's sitting on, that's red. Get it out. Okay, that looks a bit red. That vest, get it out. I kick out anything red. Then what I do is I ban everybody in the room from using the word red. Okay? Now, my rule is, just for the Londoniyyah class, while we're discussing our usual stuff, no one mentions red, no one wears red. Red is not allowed in here. Then while I'm giving the Londoniyyah class, I say, by the way guys, red does not exist. Do you know why it doesn't exist? It's not here. Where is it? You would say, well, that's circular. That doesn't make any sense. You can't use that argument. Well, in science, methodological naturalism is the governing paradigm. Now, people are obviously trying to challenge that philosophically and even sometimes legally. However, that is the way that's operating currently. So, to say God doesn't exist because we're only using naturalistic explanations and we do not mention God in any of these scientific enterprises is essentially the same thing. That God is being barred as a concept at the door of science, and then the conclusion is made, therefore there's no God. Now it's very interesting. This conflation, this ridiculous idea that there is no God, by confusing methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism, by basically saying if you adopt methodological naturalism, you have to be a philosophical naturalist. Now if you're a philosophical naturalist, you're of course going to be a methodological naturalist. But just because you're a methodological naturalist doesn't mean you have to be a philosophical naturalist. Now, Massimo Pigliucci, he's a philosopher of science, and again he's an atheist, a well-known philosopher of science. He again says the same thing about Richard Dawkins. He says this fallacy, that this fallacious reasoning that he's using of equating methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism, and this idea that science leads to atheism, Darwinism leads to atheism. He talks about this fallacy being used by Richard Dawkins. So the fact is, it's not just theists who are pointing out this fallacious reasoning. However, there is some nuance here which I want to get into, right? It's not just the case. It's not just the case that they're using a fallacious argument. There is something there which can be used. So Darwinism can be used to support atheism. But what we're saying is it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no God. But here's how Darwinism does make sense from an atheistic perspective. So say there's a bunch of us on an island, okay? And one of the people here happens to be an atheist. And we are brought up on this island. We look at all of the forests and the fish and the wildlife is here. We look at all these things. Now, imagine none of us have studied and we don't have any we're not scientifically literate. We don't have any concepts. Big Bang Theory, evolution. We have nothing. And if the atheist amongst us had to explain life, had to explain these things, they would have to come up with something like a naturalistic evolutionary story. They would have to. Because you can't just have these complex things. You have to have an explanation for them. And the first thing that you do with an explanation is you make it simpler. So you say, well, going back, life must have been simpler. Going back, it must have been one form of life, one cell. And where did the cell come from? Perhaps some, muddy water or whatever, some primordial soup, and that's how life evolved. Like you'll come up with this. And how did this development happen? Well, it must have happened through some naturalistic mechanism. So now you can start to see that if you're an atheist, then something like a proto-Darwinian history of life is necessarily true. So let me repeat that, because I think that's super important. If you are an atheist, then something like a naturalistic evolutionary story has to be true, because there's no other way of explaining life. Now, this is the problem. What's happened is they are starting off with a naturalistic lens, and that colors the data. So if you believe there's no God, then you don't need evidence from genetics. You don't need evidence from biochemistry, anatomy, linguistics, psychology, anthropology, paleontology, bioinformatics. You don't need any of that. Conceptually, something like proto-Darwinism has to be true if there's no God. So in a way, evidence is irrelevant. So this goes to show, firstly, that when they try and say, well, evolution, Darwinian evolution shows atheism is correct. Well, we need to say to them, well, if you're an atheist, then you have basically no choice. Something like a naturalistic evolutionary history has to be there. So this is why, and I think this is very important. Lamarck, like I mentioned, believed in multiple origins of life. Multiple origins of life. People before Lamarck, they also had the same idea. Darwin, he believed in one origin. And the Darwinists today, they believe in one origin. No one really questions this. Why one? Now, origination probability is something I want to introduce here, right? Origination probability is what is the probability for the origin of life. Now, the origination probability, if it's 0, that means life is what?
Impossible.
Impossible. If it's 1, what does it mean? It's going to happen all the time. Okay. If it's 50, what does it mean? If it's 0.5, what does it mean? It can happen. It's 50% chance, whatever. Okay. What they've done is they've set. It's a presupposition. It's an axiom. It's an assumption, unverified assumption, that the origination probability is close to 0. That's there. Obviously, Lamarck didn't believe in that. The ancient Indus Valley civilization theorists didn't believe in that. Others didn't believe in that. The Greeks didn't believe in that.
Last question is,
Yes.
do you know with origination probability is in order for the probability to be assessed, do there have to be the initial conditions? So, for example, when they say that abiogenesis happened and the first life happened, surely they had some idea of some kind of initial conditions, so whatever it was that they're saying. So are we assessing the origination probability based on that initial condition, or are we saying this is the probability assessment and this could be at any time, even now?
Yep. Okay, good. That's an excellent question. So I think there's two different things you've asked there about whether it can happen now, and one is about how did they assess that based on initial conditions. And the first thing to note is this first cell that they propose happened about 4 billion years ago. So the initial conditions, and especially at the time of Darwin, they didn't even know how old the Earth actually was. You know, the dates were still off by a huge margin. So it wasn't to do with them coming up with the origination probability based upon the initial conditions, because they didn't know what the initial conditions are, and even today we actually don't. So they assumed that the conditions are very rare, because if something comes into being and that thing is like, for example, Darwin believed that this first cell must have been very simple, but what we discovered was actually, the Francis Crick and Watson and the double helix DNA, all that good stuff. what we found throughout the 20th century, as we looked deeper and deeper and deeper, is that there was immense complexity. You know, you could describe the first cell, right, not as flagellum, as what Darwin thought it was. You could describe the first cell as London at 9:08 p.m., right? So you'll have trains, buses, businesses, people going out in takeaways, people moving around, people holding classes, some guy getting shanked. Yeah, that you'll get a buzzing, lively London rather than flagellum. You'll get that. So the first cell is immensely complex, and that doesn't obviously fit. That doesn't obviously fit their ideas. So what we find is that if the origination probability is higher, there's a few problems. Number one, this for them reeks of creationism. This for them is something which is going to reintroduce God. Wait, if we're getting these things popping up, there might be a God, there might be this, there might be that. So they have to, in Dawkins' word, what he calls it in the God delusion, we just need the first stroke of luck. The first stroke of luck. And then we'll explain the rest. The way that one theorist put it, and I found this hilarious. I tried it with this this atheist who was having a debate with. I said essentially, look, their argument is, give us one miracle and we'll explain the rest. That's essentially what they're saying. Just give us that one miracle, we'll explain the rest. But we're saying, no, we're not going to give you the first miracle. So the origination probability being close to 0 is very problematic. Now, what they tried to do some decades ago is they tried to actually reverse engineer the conclusion and say, we're going to show that the initial conditions were so and so, so therefore this initial self-replicating molecule could actually come. So this is the famous Miller-Urey experiment, which I'm sure some of us have heard of, maybe even if we're old enough actually studied in school, and that's been totally debunked, right? So even that feeble attempt to try and, you know, retrospectively come up with what happened 4 billion years ago turned out to be, you know, not empirically sound. Let's just leave it. That's being charitable, to be blunt. So they don't have evidence for this. They do not have evidence for this. Now the other thing is, you have origination probability of being close to 0, but there's a second probability. So we have the tree of life, we have the origin, and then we have the entire tree. So you go into these different branches, so you'll get one line evolving, another line evolving, you'll get different domains, families, genres, all this type of good stuff. So this all came from the first cell. So there has to be a transition probability. Why can't, for example, we have something as simple as bacteria? Okay, now how do bacteria, have offspring? Let's put it that way, right? How does it happen? Do they find Mrs. Bacteria, Mr. Bacteria? Huh?
Asexual reproduction.
Asexual reproduction. The most effective, right? Now, you're trying to get married, and some of the young men here, yeah, you have to, go find a sister, do this, do that, make this person happy, make that person happy. They're asking you, do you have a job? Oh yes, I have a job. What grades did you get? This. It's all complicated. Then you try and get married, and she's secretly using contraception. whatever, right? Whatever. Anything. It's a complicated world. Yeah? But with bacteria, asexual reproduction. Right? The thing is, for the benefit of the tape. All right, so what we have is they have to make assumptions about transition probabilities. So we have Homo sapiens, them evolving from an ape-like creature, going back all the way to, you know, reptiles, fish, and so on and so forth. But you gotta, if you have a transition probability of 0 or close to 0, what does that mean?
Means it stays the same.
Means it stays the same. Or if we have different forms of life today, they didn't originate from something else. If you make the transition probability 1 or close to 1, what does it mean? You can have evolution. You can have changes. Now they set, again, it's a presupposition, it's an axiom, it's an unverified claim. They say the transition probability is close to 1. So coupling the origination probability being close to 0 and the transition probability being close to 1, you automatically get the tree of life. Because all of life can only have one last universal common ancestor, what they call Luca. And transitions can happen. So in a way, anything they try and pull out from genetics or, you know, biochemistry or whatever is irrelevant. The conclusion is already there. Which is why if you find the, for example, critics of Darwinism, especially intelligent design proponents, and even not even intelligent design proponents, you get people like Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist philosopher, or Jerry Fodor, or James Shapiro, or Lynn Margulis, who are atheists and agnostics. You'll find them pointing out these types of issues that, look, Darwinism is essentially, like Lynn Margulis calls it, an Anglo-Saxon religion. Thomas Nagel basically says it's not that this idea that life evolved in his famous book Mind and Cosmos. He basically says it's not just that life evolved from this simple cell without God, a designer, and into all these forms of life. This is an assumption governing the scientific enterprise, not a conclusion. And he's an atheist. He's an atheist philosopher saying this because it is abundantly clear when anybody looks at the presuppositions, that if you give yourself those claims, if those claims go unchecked, then your tree of life is already there. Your entire story is, fitting in well. Now there's still some gaps. In when they make their entire history. So one of the gaps is obviously that when we have this tree of life and they evolved, these creatures, the problem is we have something here in the tree of life and something here in the tree of life, and they both seem to have the identical biochemical markings. They both seem to have a similar DNA sequence. They both seem to have a similar anatomy, but they can't possibly have a recent common ancestor because they're on different branches. So then they'll come up with things like homoplasy, or what they call convergent evolution, which is natural selection hit upon the same conclusion. So you have independently the human eye, or not human eye, the eye evolved independently in all these creatures. But then there's the residual problem and the initial problem, which is, well, where did this first cell come from? This immensely complicated cell, which I referred to earlier as London at its busiest time, right? Where did that come from? Well, this is where, when Francis Crick, who is, I would say, a very honest, a very, frank Darwinist, he realized this is a huge problem for them. You know, if they're going to try and make everything simple and you go to the first cell and it's immensely complex, you've got some explanation to do. So he didn't have a problem in a designer. He didn't have a problem with something greater than human beings, which he actually referred to as his theory of panspermia. Panspermia. Now remember, this isn't just some random scientist working in their mum's basement. This is a Nobel-winning scientist who discovered the structure of DNA. That famous story, you know, you're studying in Cambridge, mashallah, you know, you have that thing where these guys were in the pub and, you know, they were doing, they came and made the announcement and they discovered the double helix and all that famous stuff. This Francis Crick basically says that initial life was seeded on Earth by aliens who sent it down on rockets. Like, this is absolutely bizarre. So you have, you know, the anything but God hypothesis, right? Anything but God is fine. And, you know, interestingly, when Richard Dawkins, when someone cornered him, there's a famous documentary online called No Intelligence Allowed. No Intelligence Allowed. It's about how academic freedom is curtailed in, you know, Darwinian circles, and how people are basically persecuted and cancelled and, you know, all this stuff. And I've directly spoken to people who, you know, they're publishing something benign, like they're just publishing in some scientific journal, and the journal finds out that they are linked to the intelligent design movement, and their paper doesn't get published, even though their paper has nothing to do with intelligent design. Like, and these aren't stories like on the internet or the documentary. These is people I've spoken to. Like, this direct cancellation. But anyway, in that No Intelligence Allowed, I've forgotten the name of the American guy who goes and interviews Dawkins right near the end, and he asks him about this, right? And Dawkins says perhaps life was, you know, sent down to Earth from these extraterrestrial beings, which, you know, are in another part of the universe. And what's interesting is when he's pushed on that, when he's actually asked, well, you know, where did they come from? So if life came to Earth via these extraterrestrial beings, these aliens, where did they come from? And Dawkins gives the most splendid reply you can imagine. Well, they must have evolved via some Darwinian mechanism. Right? So what we find is that when we look at the entire story that they come up with, they already have the conclusions, and it's about finding the evidence. It's similar to how if we're to play Cluedo and I'm to you know, just decide from the beginning that the butler committed the murder, and that's it, and everybody else's view or evidence, I'll say, is I'm going to reverse engineer it for that conclusion. That's essentially the way that the field is working at the moment. That we have this huge issue where even the scientists who are working within the field, they wouldn't be aware of these presuppositions. They wouldn't be aware of the link between naturalism and Darwinism. They wouldn't know how these things are linked. They wouldn't even know about the fallacy of equivocation. They wouldn't even know about methodological naturalism, philosophical naturalism. They wouldn't know about any of these things. And what we find is that most of the discussions that are happening in terms of Darwinian theory is to do with science. But the reason why I wanted to do this session was to show that you can't just start off with the science. You have to get into the philosophy first, because it's the presuppositions that they hold that will help you see what is actually going on. If the scientists are staring at bacteria, then it's the job of the philosophers to observe the scientists and look at how they're coming to conclusions. And once we see how they're coming to conclusions, we can actually start to see the entire story unfold. What is the role of origination probabilities, transition probabilities? How do they come up with these things? Why is it the case that if you are a naturalist, then something like a Darwinian history of life, fair enough, you can replace it with something else, but something like a naturalistic evolutionary history of life in which you simply have natural selection, the survival of the fittest amongst an offspring, random mistakes in the DNA copying mechanism, and voila, you have all of life. And it's honestly, guys, when you study this stuff and you look at the claims being made about natural selection and the actual evidence that they actually have, it is underwhelming. It is actually underwhelming. Now, I wanted to end upon a quotation by Richard Lewontin. Richard Lewontin he just passed away recently. He was a Harvard evolutionary scientist, an atheist, very well respected. In fact, you should be able to find some stuff by. Here you go. Stephen Jay Gould is one of the people who co-authored with him, and he's a big name. He's a big name within the field, and he captures this link between Darwinism and naturalism. And the quote's a little bit long, but it's definitely worth reading. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a priori commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So what we find here is that there is a clear understanding. This is Richard Lewontin. There is a clear understanding on the part of well-versed scientists who are looking at the field not just as scientists but as observers who look out a bit further, that actually there is a direct correlation between naturalism and Darwinism, and this positive feedback loop, this conclusion which is essentially reverse engineered. Because if you believe in naturalism, like I've been mentioning all night, you would have to believe in some sort of proto-evolutionary story. This thing is accepted, and if you point this out, if you actually point this out, this is not something that they can deny. I just want to go over one last resource which I think is very important for this, which is in 2016, which is not that long ago, we had Michael Roos. Michael Roos is a very important authority in the history of evolutionary thought. In fact, he has written more books on this topic than anybody else. He's an atheist, so he has no truck with us, and he's a Darwinist as well, so he definitely is not going to be agreeing with us in terms of our theology. Now, what does he say? He says Darwinism is a religion. In fact, that is the name of his book, Darwinism as Religion. And this is not just a book that was that went unnoticed in academia. He published this book with Oxford University Press, which is phenomenal if you think about it. That is you can't get better than that. And in that book, he argues that from the beginning till today, Darwinism is not just science. He accepts it's science. He accepts that it's valid science. He accepts it's a valid theory, model, paradigm. But he says it's something more than that. It is a secular religious perspective. It is in fact a religion. And it is, just like Julian Huxley said, a competitor to Islam, Christianity, and traditional belief systems. So I hope in this short session that you have been enlightened by the history of Darwinism and its link to naturalism and the problems that actually exist within this field, which are not being highlighted at a popular level. So until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.